last week we discussed the very famous verse which gives us the the ladder of rise of a human being. In context, we did bring up the ladder of fall, which comes in the second chapter of the Gita. Whether be the ladder of fall or whether be the ladder of rise of a human, as we mentioned, it all starts with an innocuous thought. Whether the thought, whether be it nurtured, whether the thought is examined or the thought is left to itself, it results in the ladder of rise or the ladder of fall. Now, just quickly, can we have the ladder of fall? The ladder of fall, we said it all starts with a thought. The thought becomes attachment. Attachment becomes desire. Desire, when goes out of control, becomes anger. When anger mounts, it creates a delusion. And when you get deluded, there's a loss of memory. The loss of memory leads to a loss of human intellect. The loss of intellect leads you to total destruction. Do we have that ladder? Can it be shown? And then we also have the ladder of rise. The ladder of rise starts with satsang. Satsang is a conscious choice of giving in the right stimuli. As we learned, the transactions of life, the receipt of stimuli, the reaction within your personality, and your responses back into the world. The 3 R's, as we said. When you take care of the first stimuli, which is the receipt, which is akin, we compared it to the raw material which is fed into a manufacturing unit. Yes, so this is the ladder of rise. It starts with, yes, so next please. So the 3 transactions of life we mentioned, the first is receipt, the receipt of stimuli from the organs of perception. R1 is compared to the raw material which is fed into a manufacturing unit. From one end, the raw material goes in, and the raw material has to be of the highest quality. And once the raw material goes in, then there is the machinery, the processing, which is compared to the reaction which happens to your inner personality, which is your mind and intellect. So you need to be mindful of the quality of your emotions and the quality of your intellect. What is the purity of your mind and the clarity of your thoughts? This is paramount. It's like every now and then you keep servicing the machinery. You keep oiling and greasing, and it goes through an overall check so that the machinery is functioning optimal. So you must check, a constant check, whether your mind is pure of feelings and emotions, how chaste and pure your emotions are, how clear and precise are your thoughts, because this is what that's going to receive the raw material which is sent in. How careful you are of the receipt coming into you, there are always chances that something unexpected comes in, isn't it? Something which you don't want to comes in. And then what do? Your intellect and mind take over and do at best to process it. And once you have done, the third is the responses back into the world through the organs of action. All right. Now, we did mention of this, and then we spoke about the role and realm, how conscience comes in plays in our lives, didn't we? Sriniji, did we mention of the conscience?
I think you touched upon it, right?
Yes.
Right at the end.
Yeah. What was the context we brought it up?
If I recollect, it was more controlling the conscience, if I'm not mistaken, correct? Something towards that effect. The conscience, consciousness, and
We're not testing you here anyway.
no, I'm just trying to think the consciousness, and the conscience. That's what we discussed right at the end.
Yeah, we spoke about how conscious you are of your actions.
Correct.
And you seek the guidance of the conscience leading towards the consciousness.
Consciousness, yeah.
Now, there's something which I wanted to bring it up to you all. There is something known as the three voices within. You must be able to differentiate between the different voices from within. So before I present it, can anyone tell me what are the three voices that come from within you? And you need to know what they are so that you are able to give yourself a proper direction to your actions. Right throughout your life, the three voices that within, from within. Michelle, any guess? I'm sure at least you'll get one or two. What are the three voices within?
I would think your higher consciousness would be one.
The higher consciousness, all right?
The higher you.
The higher you, yeah.
And then
you can say the lower you.
I was thinking that the inner critic in you, the one that self-sabotages you.
Yeah.
But I'm completely guessing. I don't know.
No problem. But you're not wrong at all when you say there's the voice of the higher. And there are the two voices.
So not the higher, the lower, and the
mediocre.
The being. No,
the
I'm
medium.
thinking the one in life, the one that's bombarded, the one that's watching everything, the one that's misinterpreting.
Okay. So we can categorize them into these three. Right? Anybody else? What are the three voices you hear constantly? Every action you perform, you have the three voices. What are the three voices? And each one is distinct from the other. One has a unique flavor. Sudhakarji is saying good, bad, and ugly. How can you categorize them as good, bad, and ugly? Yeah, Vijayaraghavanji.
Guruji, is it a mind, intellect, and conscience?
Yes, it is. The three voices from within is the voice of the mind, the voice of your intellect, and then the voice of your own conscience. The three distinct characteristics of the voices from within: the mind, the intellect, and the conscience. So can we have that slide, Ravinderji, please? So these are the three voices: the voice of the mind, the intellect, and the conscience. Now, what is the voice of the mind? Yes, sir, please. The next slide, please. I must say this is not exhaustive, but there is enough to give information as to what is the mind. So the voice of the mind is there is that element in you which is very impulsive, which is inconsistent. It is variable. You are unconscious. When your actions are unconscious, they are of the mind. Your actions become mechanical and routine. When you operate on mere feelings and emotions, when you operate on your desires, your likes and dislikes, your mind is always erratic. There are no reasons given why a mind does. Such actions can lean towards, you call actions driven by the mind as a passive actions. Passive actions are those which could be towards the good or bad, which means they could be selfish or unselfish. The mind is that which goes into this tendency of craving, lingering, and indulging. It runs behind the instant gratification, what you call as bhoga, sensualistic and materialistic. It is known as the path of prayers, which is the pleasant, contrary to the path of shreya, which is of good. Your mind constantly develops expectations. Your mind is that which runs into the past and the future. Your mind constantly justifies. It develops attachment. It becomes possessive. It overwhelms you with emotions. You get excited. This is the variable, means it is different from person to person. And your mind, your feelings can be right, can be wrong at times. Now, get an idea as to what this is. So there is a voice from within which tells you to do certain things. It could be, so there is the impulsive aspect, there is the aspect which is erratic. It operates on desires, on emotions, on likes and dislikes. So your actions can either be driven by this voice, this calling from within. And then there is a clear difference from the voice of the intellect. The voice of the intellect here, we are categorizing it as the gross intellect. You will differentiate with the voice of the conscience. The gross intellect, an intellect is that which gives reasons. It gives various, it analyzes pros and cons. It is analytical. It is consistent. Unlike the wavering mind, it is relatively consistent. It is conscious. When actions are conscious, it is categorized under the intellect. Intellect is also variable, means the intellect in me is different from the intellect in you. Even in your own life, your intellect constantly keeps changing. It fluctuates. And your intellect is defined by the convictions you have. What are our convictions? Convictions are those which are molded through your own course of life, your own experiences, the various knowledge, These are the various factors that influence your thinking and conditioning. At some stage of your life, you believed I need to be a vegetarian. For some reason, you thought it is better to be a vegetarian. On what basis you believe that you prefer to be a vegetarian? There are certain arguments, there are certain perceptions. You're molded by certain input, certain knowledge. Certain situations would have prompted you to think in a particular way, and you come to a conviction that yes, it is better to be a vegetarian. 2 years later, you think, I think it's better to be a vegan, not even a vegetarian. And so on and so forth. Another person thinks, no, there's nothing wrong being a non-vegetarian. Or he's convinced with it. So there are certain convictions. And that intellect, when your actions are driven by the intellect, those actions are known as aggressive actions. Aggressive actions, when aggression is not a physical level. You're talking about the capacity to use your intellect consciously. When you're thoughtful, when you're mindful of what you do, those actions are called aggressive. And that can be leaning towards the good or the bad. Your actions can be towards your own selfish being or towards a larger cause, an unselfish cause. Again, it differs from person to person. Your intellect can be right, can be wrong. Your intellect is that which develops an attitude of detachment. Now, this is, again, if you noticed, it is distinct from the voice of the mind. There is the voice of the mind, the voice of the intellect, and then there is the voice of the conscience. The voice of the conscience is a role, it belongs to your subtle intellect. So conscience is an aspect of your subtle intellect. It is non-variable. When you say non-variable, it is the same in everyone. It is this conscience is the same in a sinner or a saint. It is the same in you throughout the course of your life. It is the only factor that doesn't change. And the voice, it is known as the voice of God. It is that entity in you which guides you towards the higher. It points towards the reality. Just like a mariner's compass constantly points towards the truth, the reality, the consciousness. Mariner's compass points toward the north. So also is your conscience constantly pointing towards the reality. I'll explain the later part of it. Yes, sir. Can we have the audience back, please? Have you got hold of the broad differences we're talking about? One is you operate on your feelings and emotions. Another is an action which is driven on the mere rationality. The third is an action which is driven by or which is supported by the conscience. So when you perform an action, it is not necessarily that you're doing the right thing. When you do an act, there could be a certain feeling of comfort or discomfort within, isn't it? So when you perform an action, if you feel a sense of discomfort, that means your conscience is not supporting that act. But the same action at a later stage, you could feel very comfortable doing it. The same conscience which didn't support it earlier supports it now, or vice versa. I know people who were they led a life of being a non-vegetarian. All through their lives, they have been non-vegetarians. But certain thought processes has changed and they became vegetarians. So what they were comfortable doing till then, later on they were uncomfortable. So what is right for them, the same action becomes wrong for them later. So there's no action per se which is right or wrong, even from your own perspective. So when your conscience supports an action, then you are living a life of truthfulness. When your conscience doesn't support any action, now here we mean an action, even an emotion or a thought. When your emotions and thoughts are not supported by the conscience, one is leading a life of sin. So a saint is one who abides by his conscience. A sinner is one who confronts his conscience. That's about all. Are you all following? Sriniji, all okay?
I'm really not able to find the subtle difference between conscience and intellect, because I think it can be confusing, because what you think your conscience is could be driven by the intellect.
Yeah, good question. So the question you're asking is, how do you differentiate between the voice of the intellect and the voice of conscience?
Yep.
Let's open up the question to others. Can anyone tell us what is the difference between the voice of the intellect and the voice of the conscience? We firstly said that the intellect is variable, the conscience is non-variable. You noted that, Srini, isn't it? Means the conscience remains the same right through your life. It is the same in you and me, it's the same in everyone. It is non-variable, it's the same. But that's not the same with your intellect. The intellect you had when you were 10-year-old, the intellect when you were 30-year-old, the intellect you had 6 months ago is not the same intellect you have today. It's constantly changing. It's variable. But you must try to examine on what is the operating procedure of the intellect. How does the intellect operate, and what is it that intellect thrives on? What is the modus operandi of the intellect?
Buddhi, right?
Yes, the intellect is the buddhi, but how does the intellect function? Because now we are trying to differentiate between the intellect and the conscience. Okay, Sriniji, just hold on. A few of them want to clarify something. Firstly, Vanita Ma, yeah, go ahead, please. We can't hear you. Could you unmute yourself first, please?
Can the intellect be manipulative and not necessarily, do the right thing
Absolutely.
based upon the situation?
Yes, the intellect can be used for aggressive good and aggressive bad. We used it. So I use my intellect with the help of a chartered accountant. How can I avoid paying taxes? So you want to use the rules and regulations just to benefit yourself, and you will go to any end how I can break the law. You're using the same manipulative intellect to satisfy your own personal ends. I want to burgle a bank, or I want to escape from the prison, or I want to do something wrong. So I need to be very careful. I'm not waiting for the Shubh Muhurtam. When is the right When is the Vastu? You look at the stars and the moon when you want to burgle a bank? No. If you, then you will be in the right place. If you wait for the good muhurtam to burgle a bank, you need to find the right moment to burgle. You can't say this is right. You can't operate on emotions thereafter. You got to have a perfect, I'm not suggesting it, please don't get me wrong. But even if you have to do that, you need to engage your intellect. So intellect can be used for the benevolence of the others. Like if I have to convey myself, I have to serve you all, I need to apply myself. How best can this knowledge serve you all? So I'm applying my intellect. I'm using my thinking ability to nurture this knowledge so that it can serve you well. I do my part, I come prepared so that I can pass this knowledge to you all so that it serves you well. It is the intellect, but the intention is to serve you all. Those actions are called aggressive good. But when actions are driven to only satisfy and gratify your own personal ends, it's called aggressive bad. So the intellect devoid of values is aggressive bad. Intellect endowed with higher values is aggressive good. And in the Mahabharata, just to give an example, Duryodhana, who manipulated the goodwill of his own cousins, the Pandavas, and usurped their throne and kingdom. Duryodhana is said to be aggressive, bad. I hope every one of you can relate to the example. Michelle, are you able to relate to the example of Duryodhana here? Have you heard of this character?
No, I have not, but I did follow what it is.
Okay.
But for a little bit, I was getting confused that intellect, the negative side of the ultimate bad side of the intellect is mind. It borderlines on mind, or because you said it's the action of, but so mind is just pure action, impulse, emotion.
Yep, that's all.
Basically the basic human instinct of us. And then intellect is the rational use of our knowledge.
Michelle, I wouldn't even say instinct is the mind. See, when you're driving on a highway or you're driving, suddenly a dog crosses you. Instinctively, intuitively, you go and press the brakes. Is it the emotion? Is it the feeling?
It's natural instinct.
It's natural. Why? Instinct is you're operating on stored information. So even without a thought or impulse, you just jam the brakes, isn't it? So I wouldn't say instinctive actions are the mind.
Okay.
Mind, no doubt it can stem from the mind, but I would not say it's the mind. Mind is when your actions are impulsive, erratic, you're operating on feelings and emotions. When you do something because you like to do it, there is no reason given. You see that? So it is a non-rational element. So when the voice from within just does something because it has a certain liking or a feel good factor. I don't feel like doing. That's about all. It doesn't give reasons. That's the mind.
Okay.
The intellect is give reasons, and the reasoning could be right or wrong.
But it's from gathered knowledge from our past, from what we've seen, all of that. That's our intellect. It's what we've gathered.
Not just gathered. You see, if you're just operating on gathered information, it's the mind, because mind is also the storehouse of information. Intellect is that which processes the information. So, yeah, intellect processes it. As we said, unconscious is the mind. Mind is very unconscious. It just does mechanical routine activity. But when you process it, when you analyze it, when you rationalize that knowledge or information, it is the intellect. Like what we are doing now, we're giving reasons. We're trying to break into the pros and cons of it. We are engaging the intellect. All right. So Duryodhana in the epic Mahabharata, Duryodhana symbolized aggressive bad, and Lord Krishna symbolizes aggressive good. He uses the same intellect, the same manipulative, the same discriminative intellect with the only objective of serving the larger good of others. So does that clarify, Vanitama? So the intellect can be good or bad. So what distinguishes good and bad is the intent. Is it done for the larger good or is it done for the personal good? I can be using the same manipulation, but what justifies the intellect being good or bad is the intent behind that act. That's all. It's a very powerful intent. I want to do good, and I would go to any extent to do good to others, short of taking the law into my hands. But I want to do good to others. I want to serve others. I want to help others. So how can my actions be constructive? So I'm very conscious of what I do, what I say, how I conduct myself. That's aggressive good. And majority of people who are aggressive bad. Small minority of people are aggressive good, very small. And the majority of people are actually passive. They operate on the mind. So are you okay, Vanitama? Okay. Mickey G, you wanted to say something, sir?
I think you covered it really well, Guruji. I was just responding to Srini's question on the intellect versus the conscience, and I was just thinking that maybe the conscience does tell you sort of good versus evil, right? It really is the deepest guide of what is right and what is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But the intellect is something that is a little more practical, I feel. The intellect can justify killing, for example. If by one killing you can save many lives, that's historically been the justification for a lot of aggression. Not all of it good, but sometimes I guess that's an intellectually justifiable action that routinely is taken.
Example?
To inflict pain. Well, I mean, for example, it's bad to kill a human being. Your conscience would not allow it. At the same time, if there is a human being that is killing many other human beings, then you can intellectually justify that one act is preventing many others. I guess it's a borderline issue, but that's how you can justify what your conscience perhaps would not allow you to do.
But how can you classify? But aren't you classifying the action as good or bad there?
Yeah, I guess so. I guess you're right. I mean, you're programmed from early childhood to learn a lot of these values, like killing is bad or stealing is bad. So I guess that is all learned knowledge in a way.
Yeah.
But it does seem that there are times when you have real conscientious objectors who refuse to take an action that the vast majority are taking, and they suffer for that. And you salute those people. There are very few of them.
Right. Now, just like a soldier goes about defending his country in a time of war.
Right.
Don't you give award? Don't you celebrate a soldier?
Exactly.
You recognize
so that's what I feel that's like the intellect acting.
No, yeah, the action is still killing. The same thing, a student picks up a gun innocently and goes about. In universities, it happens. In universities, education institutions, it can happen in any society. The same act of killing can be wrong, isn't it? Because there is a certain animosity or a hatred or a bitterness. What happened in New Zealand a few years ago? A guy walks into a mosque and starts killing people while they were doing their prayer. We all know that act. We all know that incidents are rather. So that man had a certain negative emotion towards a particular community. And such actions will not be supported by the conscience. The act is the same of killing. But if you are doing it just to satisfy your own personal emotion of bitterness or hatred or non-acceptance, then it's going to have consequences. But again, if you noted, it is the mind that does justification, Mikiji. The word justification is usually the mind. So you are doing an act, so that guy would have firmly believed that the only way I can satisfy my emotion is to eradicate them from society. Example. He would have thought that way. And he would resort to that extreme measure, and he justified that that's a very reasonable act to do. But he fundamentally was wrong because he was operating on emotion. So your emotions can be right, emotions can be wrong. We're not saying the emotions are wrong all the time. But when you have the mind, you got to check it with the conscience. Is it right to entertain this emotion? When you entertain a thought and give a certain reason, you got to check with your conscience. And Mikiji, I just wanted to pick up that statement you said, intellect is practical. Are you suggesting that the conscience isn't? Sorry, asking that question.
Sure, sure. Yeah, I think so. I mean, you know, I'm thinking more as you speak, so I'm obviously trying to recorrect. But my impression till this session started was that the conscience is relatively unbending, and it always tells you black and white, what is good and what is bad, or what is wrong, and what is. And I think, you know, just practical experience in life is that you can sense that from deep within you. Now, maybe that is also learned, so we're just kind of justifying it, but it seemed that way. Intellect to me always seemed like a more practical approach to overriding the conscience at times when it's for the greater good. Now, it's a slippery ground, but it does happen all the time. I think the mind, we understand. The mind is impulsive, and you know, and you can see the traps and all of that. So I guess I'll have to think some more. Get that difference.
Yes. So still with what Sriniji has asked, what is the difference between the intellect and conscience? Yeah, Badrinath ji.
Pranam Guruji.
Namaskar.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, can we look at it this way? We have actually two intellects, as you've pointed out, a gross intellect and a subtle intellect. And the subtle intellect is related to the conscience, right? And so the doer intellect is what we call the gross intellect. And the observer intellect is what I would call conscience. So there is always an observer, even while you're doing various things, which is kind of, it's like the innermost you. It is not directly involved in any action, but it is observing the action, and it's the observer. If you're guided by the observer, then your actions, in a sense, have to be good, because the observer seems to be, as you pointed out, it's the voice of God, or the voice of it's the most fundamental voice that we all have. And as you pointed out, it's the same whether it's in a saint or a sinner. So there is a certain observer which is very pure, and it, when you act in the full light of the observer in you, then your actions automatically become good. But when you act on the basis of your intellect, which is your rational, analytical side, the actions need not necessarily be good, because your analysis might lead you to do something that may not be right. So as we act, if we are always aware of the observer, then our analysis also might lead towards the good. But if you are unaware of the observer, then your analysis can need not lead to the good. So that subtle concept of the observer is what I would call conscience.
Very right, very right. In fact, you spelled it out very clearly. The observer, that which is detached witness to all that's happening is the conscience. So there's something within which is unconcerned, stands apart to everything that you're doing, whether it be an action, an emotion, or a thought, and it is guiding you in the right direction. As I've said, conscience is compared to the compass which points towards the north. Similarly, the conscience only points towards the truth. So what is the righteous thing for you to do? So deep within, when you are doing an action, there's something within you may not cooperate with what you're doing. Deep within, you know that I'm not doing the right thing. Deep within. But you may not have the strength to follow what the conscience is saying. Why is it you don't have the strength? I know that I'm doing the wrong thing. I know I should not do it. And yet, what is it that holds me back from following what the conscience is saying? You don't need an external tutor to come and tell you what you're doing is right or wrong. Isn't it? Every one of us know innately what whether doing right or wrong. What is it in us that Srinaji? Okay. Mayitama? Yep.
Is it desire?
It is your own desire. Yes. You get overwhelmed by your own emotions and desire. So you may not even heed the conscience. The problem is the conscience is loud and clear, but you can't heed it because it is clouded with emotions and desires. So that which clouds the conscience is your emotions. So if you want to heed your conscience, you have to calm your mind. It's only a calm mind can heed to the conscience. Srinaji? But we have not answered your question and you're raising your thumb. I don't understand.
I thought Badrinath ji gave a very good explanation of what he said, the higher and the lower intellect, as he called it, the gross and the subtle. I thought I could resonate with that.
Right. I've been speaking for 45 minutes. You didn't say anything about it. And Badrinath ji spoke for 2 minutes and you're saying, what is this?
Some of us are slow. Ask Vicky. I work for him.
So that the difference, if you want to highlight the difference between intellect and conscience, intellect is that which gives reasons. Conscience doesn't give a reason. You will know the difference from that. The subtle difference between conscience and intellect is intellect gives pros and cons and reasons. Conscience says yes or no. That's all. It's either the red light or the green light. You stop or you go. That's all. You can't ask, why are you saying stop? It tells you to stop. No, something is not right. There's a strong feeling from within that says, don't do it. It's the intellect that gives reasons, not conscience. So an innate feeling. And it's not based on action. For example, you and I know that we are not supposed to jump the traffic light. And yet, let's say you are taking someone in emergency to an hospital, you couldn't get an ambulance. So you say, let me drive myself to the hospital. You put your hazard lights on and you have to jump the signal. Your conscience will permit that, isn't it? You may be You may get a ticket for that, but you'll justify it with the hospital bill and say, sir, this is the reason why I had to do so. You may be pardoned or you may not be pardoned for that, but yet you know you're not done anything wrong. By the law, you could be wrong, but you know innately you're not wrong, even though you jumped the signal. Hmm? All okay, Srinaji?
Yep. Thank you.
Right. Arunji?
Yeah, Pranam Guruji. So I think I've come up to speed today, kind of caught up on late starter. I feel like a backbencher.
No, at all.
But, I'm new to all this, but I think, addressing the question of difference between the conscience and intellect, one way I would think, I don't know, the conscience is also called the inner voice, right?
Yes.
But in a way, I think it comes from outside. It's like an absolute fixed, guides you, as you said, compass, points you to the true north. So it's probably not with it, even though it's inside you, it comes from some other, an external entity, you could say, or a force which guides you towards the truth. Whereas intellect is usually based on your reasoning and facts and beliefs. So it could be relative. It's not absolute. It's not fixed.
Yes.
It varies because it weighs the pros and cons. I don't know if I got that right, but
Yeah, very true. So intellect is relative. It is variable. But when you say conscience is external, what do you mean conscience is external?
no, even though it's inside you, does it represent an external absolute truth? Because if you say that it is the same in everybody, and everybody is different, so by definition, it has to be, it cannot belong to that one individual. If it is the same, if it says the same thing to everyone, it cannot belong to that individual, right? I mean, I don't know if I'm putting my point across correctly, but it may have something to do with a kind of a force which guides you towards the truth. So it represents absolute right versus wrong.
Yes.
And therefore, it resides within you, but it comes from some force outside of you. That's what I'm trying to say. Is that true?
Okay. Badrinathji wants to say something.
I don't think it needs to be external for it to be there in all of us. It can be something which is all pervasive.
Yeah. So
all pervasive, then
so
also
like Brahman as the concept of, I mean, I don't want to go into philosophy and all that stuff here, but I think in a way it refers to that universal force of good or evil, as or if you've seen Star Wars, the Star Wars saga is called the Force. I mean, it's kind of the same thing which exists universally. It's the universal truth.
that's right. There is this verse in the Upanishads which says, Purnamada Purnamidam. That means that is full and this is also full. So there is no, something need not, this is, I think, very subtle thing. I mean, my understanding, I could be wrong, about this philosophy that there is no external, internal, once you look at the all-pervasive thing, the microcosm and the macrocosm seem to blend at a certain level of understanding and realization. So, yeah, so it's something that is all pervasive, across. So
you're like a vessel which captures that eternal truth. So the conscience to some extent
Yeah.
is capturing that supreme reality, or whatever you want to call it, or supreme truth, the supreme force for good, force for evil. It's all it's there. It's the same. It's constant in all of us. Is that what we're trying to say here? That's what I was trying to understand.
Yes.
Yes. So, in fact, the conscience is the common factor in all of us,
Right.
the non-variable. It is the messenger of God.
Got it.
So, it is not to be taken in the absolute sense of the consciousness, as Badrinath ji was saying of the Purnamada Idam, that is whole. This is also whole. It is talking about the consciousness there. But conscience is an aspect of subtle intellect. It is still the terrestrial. It constitutes your own matter, means the individual. Because you must separate the individual from the spirit. The spirit is the consciousness, and the matter constitutes of body, mind, and intellect. So this is two. So the spirit is the God, matter is the body, mind, and intellect. And in the intellect, we're saying there's something gross and subtle. You see, so the body, mind, intellect are variable, but there's a one non-variable element, which is the conscience. So what is right for you may be wrong for me. What is right for me is wrong for you. There's nothing as universally right or wrong. What was right for you may not be right for you now, isn't it?
Right. That's
So,
why I felt it was relative. It varies.
What varies?
But-
The conscience doesn't vary. See,
No, not the conscience, the intellect.
Correct. In fact, yes. Therefore, it is very important at every stage for your intellect to fall back on your conscience and say, am I doing the right thing? Therefore, what we must understand is when your convictions are supported by your conscience, you're being truthful. When your convictions are confronted by your conscience, you're not leading a truthful life. You're being false to yourself. I repeat, conviction is your conclusions of your intellectual arguments, isn't it? Whatever your intellect gives reasons with the knowledge, experience, all the factors into consideration, your intellect says this is the right thing for me to do. Now, that conclusion, that conviction may be right, may be wrong. Relative though. But at that point, it is for me to find out, is this conviction supported by my conscience? And if it supports it, you're not wrong to yourself. It's not what others feel. You're being truthful to yourself.
But one question there, Guruji, is how
Yeah.
do you know? I mean, because sometimes it's hard to know whether it's your conscience that is telling you that or your intellect which is telling you that. Sometimes it's hard to distinguish. So I guess you need to have clarity of mind and to know whether, I guess deep inside everybody knows, but sometimes some people are not able to hear that voice.
Now, I did mention, very good question. In fact, we are coming back to the same question what Srini asked. How do you differentiate between the intellect and the conscience? A very, very pertinent thing, because we may be made to believe it's the conscience.
Right.
We could be easily be misled to conclude that it's the conscience saying. So therefore, as you rightly said, there is a deep voice from within which clearly tells me. But the rational aspect of it is the intellect. The conscience is a non-rational aspect. It doesn't give reasons why you're doing. It just says yes or no. As Badrinath ji said, it is an objective witness. It stands apart. It's like the Supreme Court, the highest authority. It just gives you an inner permit, or it doesn't give a permit. Now there is a verse in the Gita. Ravindra ji, could we have that verse, please? In fact, every action you perform, you need to take your confidence into account. Every action. And if you don't, you are in trouble because you have committed a sin. And every action has a cause and effect. Every action has a consequence. So the 13th chapter, the 23rd verse of the Gita, which says, Upadrashtanumanta cha bharta bhokta maheshwaraha paramatmetyuchapyuktaha dehesmin purusha paraha. Now please fall back on this particular verse where he says the supreme Purusha, here it refers to the self, which is the spirit in this body, is thus said to be. Now here he's saying how the self, the Atman, the reality, seems to play different roles in different individuals. So at times the self is either the witness or the permitter or supporter, enjoyer, or the great Lord, or the Supreme Self. How the self, which Badrinathji said that self is a witness to your actions, the same self which is a witness starts permitting your actions. Certain actions, it supports it. It makes you enjoy them. You become the great Lord. You command everything that you do. Ultimately, you merge back into the Supreme Self. So the various roles it plays. Yes, sir. Thank you. So the various role the conscience plays. You can understand it from the level of conscience. Now, the fact that I've brought this verse is sometimes conscience is a mere witness to your action. Sometimes conscience permits it. You start enjoying it. Then you become the Lord. Then you become the Supreme Self. Now, how is it conscience plays seemingly different roles? This is based on the degree of your selfishness. If your actions are extremely selfish and self-centered and egoistic, the Atman or the conscience is a mere witness. It has got nothing to do with it. When you want to go on doing it, go on doing it, man. I have got nothing to do with it. But the moment your actions are turn more purer, you're more unselfish, you're more sacrificial, your conscience or your self starts permitting you. It allows you to do it. Anumanta. Like you give it permission to the child. It's all right, but go and play. It's fine. You can go out. So you're given the permission. So the conscience is permitting you. And then you start. What's the next thing? Shriji? What's the next thing in the order? First is a witness. Next is the?
Well, it's a permitter.
Permitter. It permits. Then
it supports, enjoys.
It starts supporting. Support means you get the confidence of the conscience because your actions have become more unselfish,
acceptable.
More acceptable. Why? It's all because your attitude has changed. Your actions are more purer, sacrificial in nature, so the conscience supports it. Then comes the enjoyer. You start enjoying certain things. When do you enjoy an action? Or you could be doing the same thing with a great guilt within, isn't it? When you're being truthful to yourself, you start enjoying that same action. And what has changed? The attitude. Same conscience which was mere witness, you are enjoying it. And then you become the very Lord. Means you become the supreme commander. You command everything. You above everything. And this beautifully, that verse highlights how you go through different phases based on different attitudes you have at different stages of your actions. Arunji, Sriji, hold on. I know you wanted to say something. Arunji.
Yes, Guruji.
Now you see how the conscience, how it plays different roles based on different nature of your actions.
Right.
And it's all internal. It's right within you. And different actions, your conscience behaves differently. And conscience doesn't mix the previous action to this action. The earlier action I did was wrong, your conscience says wrong. This action I'm doing right, conscience says yes. It may be a supporter, it may be a witness to the previous action. So conscience is constantly being evaluated against your emotions and your thoughts. Remember this. So if your emotions are pure and chaste, your conscience will support. If your emotions are impure and your thoughts are gross and selfish, your conscience will not support. It pricks you within. You feel a sense of guilt, an uncomfortable feeling. And this is subjective, purely subjective. Therefore, we are all the time told, be true to yourself first. It is not being truthful to others. Now, I have chosen a field which is innately me. I wanted to do this. It's not whether my family agrees to it, whether my friends agree to it, whether society accepts it or not. It's not what I want to do. It's important what I want to do it, isn't it? It's not an egoistic decision, but I must be comfortable doing. Just because I have got example, let's say I have a family of which has done established business for 50, 60 years. Let's say if I'm the only son and I just take over the business as an heir to the lineage of the business family, and just because business is an opportunity or is something there ready for me, if I get into business, I'm not being true to myself. But I chose philosophy because this is my dharma. This is my nature. And I have to be true to myself. So what to and what not to do. All of us in a dilemma, isn't it? And one choice you make is detrimental, is wrong. In the choice, one is detrimental, one is beneficial. One is evolutionary, one is devolutionary. So at every juncture, you've got to fall back. Am I to do this or am I to do that? And the intellect has to consult the conscience. The mind doesn't consult. So there's a chance you would go wrong. But the intellect has to consult the conscience. And you can only think when your mind is calm. So before you plunge into the action, you got to pause. You got to be patient. You got to calm your mind and just look within. Am I doing the right thing? But if you don't allow that moment of pause or patience and you just rush into the action impulsively, invariably you will be repenting. Invariably, because it's your emotion, as Vahintama rightly said earlier, it's your desire and emotion that takes over. Invariably you feel, oops. So as I've said, this, you need to ponder over it. The three voices, the voice of the mind, the voice of the intellect, the voice of the conscience, distinct and unique. And if you ponder over well, you will be able to highlight how unique and distinct each one is. And it's right from your early stage of your life, it's coming in. Sriniji?
If I may, if you permit me, I understood the whole concept of when your actions align with your conscience, you're at peace with yourself and you feel you're true to yourself, therefore you're right. I get that concept. But what if I let's say I'm a hunter. My conscience says that's all I know is killing is good, because that's survival. And I'm at peace with myself with the actions and my conscience as a killer, as a hunter. So I'm perfectly at peace with myself. So how do you resolve that? Because you yourself said what may be good to you may not be good to the others.
Yeah. So, but sir, I don't think your approach is right, because you're evaluating that action from whose standpoint are you evaluating?
Correct.
You only have to evaluate it from your own conscience, full stop. And if you have ascertained it is not my mind, it is not my intellect, it is only my conscience. If I have been an aboriginal, imagine an aboriginal living somewhere deep in the woods and the jungles, don't know civilization, and all his life, all the generations he has lived, they've lived there, they've lived that kind of a life. They live just hunting and living with what nature provides them. And that's all they know. You can't go and give them a lecture to them and say, killing is wrong. You know what you're doing. You would look back and say, man, what do I say? And all I know is this. And he is 100% right. He's true to himself. His conscience is clear. He is not wrong. But tomorrow you take a gun and say, I also want to do hunting, you will be accountable. You will be in serious trouble. But the aboriginal is left free. The government will not interfere and they leave them to themselves. The same act is right for them, is wrong for you. So don't use any external parameter to gauge your action as right or wrong. It's your own conscience ultimately. But you got to be very sure it is your conscience, because it's very, very likely you might, the power of emotion and the justification may cloud your ability to heed what your conscience is saying. That's very much a possibility. So sleep over it, think 10 times before you commit to an act. But if you're impulsive, invariably you could be wrong. Harishji?
Guruji, if you permit me,
Yes, sir.
I mean, my little mind is very simplistic and therefore it doesn't get into the very complex issues. But I thought an example which you briefly gave illustrated the whole thing very beautifully in very simple terms. This was the example which you gave of you rushing a patient to the hospital and you break the red light. Now, there are various aspects to this. One is the consequences of your action. You will continue to have to pay. You may get a fine, as you said, you may have some penalties. However, when you talk of the voice of the intellect, it gives you the reason why you should or should not have done this. And therefore, what it enables you to do is not make it right or wrong, but it enables you to escape the guilt. And this escaping of guilt is what I think sometimes we confuse with peace. Peace and escaping of guilt are not necessarily the same thing, though when you escape guilt, you do get a certain element of peace. However, having said that, the intellect is what enables you to escape guilt in this particular action. It still does not change the act of being right or wrong, which is the act of the conscience. And then when the intellect interacts with the conscience at that brief instance, then you have the role, because of the larger cause involved or the larger reason involved, you find that the conscience actually becomes a permitter.
Yep.
Right? So I thought that example really encapsulates, in a very simple terms, which is all that I could understand, so what exactly is this whole difference between the three voices? One which is unchanging, one which is relative, and therefore not absolute, and which justifies, or not justifies, which gives you the reason, and which permits you to escape or not escape guilt, right? And then there is the action itself.
Perfect. Wonderful, Ji. Wonderful. Yes. Yeah. Very good, Ji. Vijay Ji, you wanted to say something? Please, we may just spill over by a few minutes.
Yeah, I think
please
it
bear
might,
with us.
and I just possibly leave my doubt, and maybe I can take it up later, is that what is the role of the existing moral or legal framework on the shaping of conscience? I mean, the reason why I'm asking is what I would feel guilty about 20 years back, sometimes you don't feel guilty about now. guilty in the reasonable sense, in the with a change in values or whatever. One. Second doubt is that okay, my conscience is clear as to what I ought to do, but certain things I cannot do because that is not my duty, that's not my dharma, nor in a conventional sense, nor my authority either. I mean, this is like a police not acting to stop something wrong. He's not doing his dharma. But if I do the same thing, I'm overstepping my dharma.
Yep.
So this is a little in terms of how I act after listening to the conscience and what is the possible changeability of the conscience is what I was confused about. Maybe we can talk later. It's time.
Yeah, it's certainly a lot of food for thought. We certainly come back to it, Vijayaraghavanji.
Thanks, Guruji.
Yeah. Michelle, all okay?
All is
Nikki?
well.
All is
The
well.
stoplight, the emergency room stoplight, that analogy works very well for me. Thank you so much.
I'm sorry, I didn't get you there. Could you come again?
The emergency room, rushing the lights and justifying, that analogy helps me more than all of it because it condenses it to a real life situation that I can process in my mind when I do things.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm glad. Yeah. You got all the clarity because Hareji spelled it so clearly, isn't it?
We think on the same wavelength.
I know that. All right. Srinivasji, all okay? We'll come back. Please do ponder on these and we'll come back. Okay. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Harihi Om. Shri Guru Bhyo Namaha. Harihi Om.